My name is Nanya Thompson, and I'm an immigration lawyer. I've been licensed to practice law since 2007, and I've only practiced immigration law. I am a solo attorney. I have a law office based in downtown San Diego, and I represent immigrants in different kinds of immigration processes, from applying for affirmative family-based benefits, humanitarian relief, such as asylum, also citizenship and naturalization, deportation defense, and then some employment side visas.
Now that United for Ukraine has been introduced, do you believe that Title 42 will still be lifted?
The lifting of Title 42 is being litigated currently, and my understanding is that a court in Louisiana actually halted the Biden administration's plans to terminate Title 42. So I think it's a temporary injunction, and there's a court date within the next couple of weeks for the hearing regarding whether or not they can unwind or terminate the program.
How does that process work when ending a policy like Title 42?
Yeah, so when you're trying to end a program, an administrative program, you have to go through a regulatory period where you explain, in some cases you have to go through a regulatory period where you explain why you're ending or terminating the program. So this Title 42 is unique because it was invoked by the CDC. So the CDC is, I guess, the ultimate makes the ultimate determination of whether it continues. And my understanding is that they gave their consent to the Biden administration to terminate it. And the Biden administration is going through with their plans to terminate it. But when an administration announced the end of a program, of course, people who are in favor of the program are going to fight back against it and possibly look at maybe some technical issues with how the process was wound down and try to find some sort of legal error and then file suit, which is what happened in this case. So it happens a lot. You saw it most famously in the context with DACA. So it was the reverse in that sense. The Trump administration tried to terminate the program. The DACA students filed lawsuit against it, saying that it was not terminated correctly. I think the main concern in that case is they're arguing that the Trump administration didn't consider the actual consequences of the termination of the program. How it would affect businesses and students and families. And so so in this case it's the opposite now. The people who are less in favor of favorable immigration policy are arguing for the Biden administration to continue the program.
How does it work for people who are in MPP? Are they still able to go through the asylum process?
MPP is really for people who are not subject to Title 42. So and I actually haven't looked at exactly, which country is subject to Title 42. I don't know exactly under the regulations how they're able to subject certain countries. I think the issue comes down to whether or not Mexico will agree to take them back, because they're not deporting them, they're expelling them. And there's a difference, because when you're deporting someone, we normally have a memorandum of understanding, kind of a contract with the country that they're being deported to. And so we have to follow that memorandum of understanding, and then the country generally will accept them back. With the expulsion, you're not deporting them back to their country under Title 42, you're just sending them back to Mexico. So the key, I think, is going to come down to whether or not Mexico is going to accept you back. So Mexico has agreed to accept back most of the Central American countries, although I think there's some exceptions. For example, many Nicaraguans, for some reason, do not get subject to Title 42 and are not sent back. Venezuelans and Cubans are not subject to Title 42 and not sent back. So my understanding under MPP 2.0, that's what they're calling it, because it was reinstated by a court order, it's mostly people who are not subject to Title 42, so Venezuelans and Cubans. But then again, there are some people who are still able to get in from different countries. Like I most recently helped somebody from Romania who was able to enter the country was not subject to Title 42 and also was not put into MPP. When you hear a lot about how, and I think a common theme nowadays is how the disparity in the treatments of different types of different people from different countries. And so you can see that by how Title 42 is applied and how MPP is applied and then who's allowed to enter the United States through humanitarian parole.
How do they decide which migrants are allowed to enter the U.S. since Title 42 limited entry of anyone coming from a country that possessed presence of COVID-19?
So if you go up to the port of entry and you ask for asylum, they will say no. It doesn't matter what country you're from. They will just say no and they won't let you in. The trick is if you enter illegally. If you enter illegally, they're not going to subject you to Title 42. So that's why some people, I don't know if you heard about the car trick. Some people were trying to, there's a few cases where people were trying to enter the country by vehicle. So they would rent like a car in Mexico or get some vehicle. They would drive through because they knew that if they drove through and got through the lines, that was the United States and they couldn't expel them anymore. So instead of entering illegally. So that was, some people were happening. And then I think there were some incidents where they refused to obey officers' orders. And I think this happened in, I want to say it was El Paso, don't quote me, but where there was an actual incident where a guard a border officer had to take action and shoot against a family that was trying to enter through this car trick. So, yeah. So under Title 42, if you ask for asylum, you will not get it. So if you enter illegally, you'll be permitted to stay and apply for asylum. Although some people who enter illegally are still subject to Title 42 and sent back, like Central Americans.
Why do you think that is?
Because Mexico has agreed to take them back. So the problem was when there was minors, right? So minors were entering illegally and then they were being sent back. And, when you're sent back, it's not like you get dropped off at like a shelter or they make sure that you're safe. You can be sent back at really any time of the evening and placed in vulnerable situations, and that was happening to minors. And so there was a lawsuit against that, and then a judge stopped it, but then I think later that lawsuit might have gotten overturned. It's really, like with immigration law, the law changes, and then there's a lawsuit, and then it goes to a higher court, and it changes, and so you're constantly having to verify and recheck what is the actual law, what is in place, what law is effective at this moment.
Is it any difficult to keep yourself up to date with the latest changes in immigration policies and laws?
Yeah, I just take it case by case. Like if I've sort of like been more practical about it. I did try to keep up with a lot of changes, but it just got really overwhelming for me, and so I just have to do my due diligence. And when I get a case or an issue, I just have to make sure that I do research. So it's like that's just the way that the game is now, and I've just kind of gotten used to it. I've gotten accustomed to it.
How would you explain Title 42?
I mean, Title 42 has essentially stopped people's ability to seek asylum in the United States. I mean, we have had these asylum laws for, decades now, and they exist because we didn't want any atrocities happening again where we turned away refugees that were, being forced into concentration camps and, murdered en masse, so we had this change in the law, and so you're supposed to be able to come to the port of entry and ask for asylum. So when you've ended that, what you've done is you've placed people in situations where they have nowhere to turn, and they take desperate measures into hand, where they try this car trick, which is dangerous, or they try to enter illegally, and they contract with smugglers, coyotes, who obviously have ties to cartels and place people in dangerous situations. So that's what Title 42 has done. It's ended asylum, and it's caused people to take desperate, drastic measures to seek safety.
Can you walk us through what the process of seeking asylum looks like? So
asylum, you have the right to seek asylum at the port of entry. A lot of people will come and seek asylum who have tourist visas. So you probably, I guess maybe one instance would be during when Americans withdrew from Afghanistan Afghans with tourist visas, the ones that were capable, would enter the United States, and then since they entered legally, they would be able to apply for asylum. The law says you must apply within 1 year of your entry. If you're coming from outside the country and you're asking for it at the port of entry, you claim a fear of asylum, you are immediately detained by Border Patrol. Border Patrol will keep you at the port of entry for sometimes several weeks before they can find a detention space for you. And when they find detention space, they can send you pretty much anywhere. We have a detention facility here in San Diego, close to the border, called the Otay Mesa Detention Facility. There's several through Southern California that they contract through, with the county jails. Once you are detained by Border Patrol, they will interview you, and they create a record at that interview. And many times, and I'm saying this as an immigration attorney because this is sort of one of my pet peeves, is the Border Patrol isn't there necessarily to help you. And sometimes they create a record that goes against you, and on purpose. And we know it's on purpose or intentional because we see it happen over and over and over and over again, where the clients say they claim a fear, they explain what happens, but in the documents that you receive from Border Patrol, the interview states that the immigrant said that they were coming to the United States to look for work. Many times they'll say something like, I want to be safe and find work, but the main point of it is that, I want to be safe, I'm fleeing some type of danger. And that record follows the immigrant throughout the process. And so sometimes later in court, the government attorney will then try to use that document to argue that the immigrant is lying about their claim. But after you go through the border interview, you are then placed in a detention facility where you're waiting for an interview with an asylum officer. So the interview with the asylum officer is your opportunity to really explain in detail for the first time why you are afraid to go back to your country. So again, you're creating another record with an asylum officer who interviews you. Now, the USCIS asylum officers, they're not law enforcement. So they're supposed to take a more compassionate view and help you feel protected and safe so that you can tell your story. It doesn't always happen, but that's because they're humanitarian officers and they're supposed to be trained in that sense. But some officers, I guess in more of the recent hires under the Trump administration, I've found maybe are less humane. I don't know if it's a difference in their training. But once you go through that interview with the asylum officer has to determine if there's a significant possibility that you will be able to establish that you have a fear of persecution in your country. If the asylum officer makes that determination, then you are allowed to apply for asylum. So you can imagine that sometimes during the interview, translation errors, communication errors, possibly the immigrant is stressed from being detained and taken into custody, and they don't feel safe. So sometimes the interview with the asylum officer is botched for whatever reason, and the immigrant, there's errors, and the immigrant doesn't pass. So when you don't pass, the immigration judge does give the opportunity to review that record in a hearing. And in that hearing, there's not a lot of rules, so the judge has a lot of leeway. And depending on the standards in your jurisdiction and your circuit, so we're in the Ninth Circuit, there could be a more detailed review hearing, or there could be a less detailed review hearing. It's pretty difficult to have your case overturned unless you're able to really articulate what happened and what went wrong in that interview. And by the way, Biden administration is planning on changing this asylum process. So even though this is how it is now, they want to take it away from the courts, and they want to make it more an agency-based determination, your first asylum application. So if you do pass either through the judge or through the asylum officer, you're placed in deportation proceedings, what we call removal proceedings, before an immigration judge, and you're allowed to apply for asylum. That after you pass your credible fear interview, that is the first time that the immigrant can then apply to get out of custody through a process called parole. So if you have a sponsor, you have someplace to live, you can submit the documentation to your deportation officer, and then if they find a sufficient support system, then you're able to be released. And then you can change your case from the detention facility, the court that had jurisdiction over the detention facility where you were detained, you can change it to go to whatever court that you're going to be, the nearest court near your residence. And then you go through the asylum process. And how long it takes, it really depends on that court and how backed up it is. I mean, you keep hearing the stories of how backed up the courts are, and they really are backed up. I have some cases that were scheduled for final hearings in 2019 that have not been set for a final hearing because of COVID-19.
What have you noticed is different for the Ukrainians who have been coming to seek asylum versus the other migrants who have been waiting?
Yeah, so the Ukrainians, they're briefly detained because, but I haven't gone through it, so I don't know exactly the difference between how they're actually treating somebody who's seeking asylum versus a Ukrainian. But they are not even asking for asylum. So they are just showing that they're a Ukrainian national, that they have a sponsor in the United States, and then they're allowed to come into the United States through a program called humanitarian parole. This gives them the permission to stay here for up to a year and apply for a work permit. Some people are going to be seeking other status. Generally, fleeing war-like conditions is not enough for asylum in the United States, which is shocking to a lot of people. But that's a refugee. So we differentiate between refugee and asylee, right? So refugees, they have to leave their countries for various different reasons. They go to a third country, they register with the UNHCR or some other refugee advocacy organization, and then they go through a long process before they're accepted, and maybe some are not accepted before they are accepted to a country and they come here. Asylum is you are fleeing your country because you're being harmed for some particular reason. So there's a particularized threat that you're facing in your country. And that's one of the key things in the United States is the reason why, and the asylum process is why you're seeking asylum. It is not enough that you suffered harm in your country. You must suffer harm because of your political opinion, your religion, your nationality, your race, or your membership in a particular social group. One of the issues with, you can go back to 2008 when the Haitians had the earthquake and they were fleeing. They had definitely, their country was in turmoil and they needed to get out of there, but it wasn't really enough for asylum in the United States because they were just fleeing the conditions in their country, not necessarily somebody necessarily threatening them or a particularized threat of harm. And that's why a lot of Central American claims fail under the current U.S. laws is the so-called nexus, or the reason why, the motive for the persecution, because they can't fall into one of the categories because they're mostly fleeing gang-related violence, which in many cases the courts here will interpret as just generalized crime.
Does humanitarian parole apply for asylum seekers?
It'll apply for asylum seekers when they are, if they're sent to the detention facility and they must, and they apply to be released on parole, which they make a distinction and they call it conditional parole. So you're paroled by an immigration officer from a detention facility. And not everyone who seeks asylum is necessarily detained. Juveniles, they go into the Health and Human Services and the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So they go into more of a, I guess it wouldn't be a detention facility setting. It'd be more like a, I don't know, some type of foster care type of situation. And then families, the Biden administration has made the decision not to detain families. So if you enter as a family unit, then you're allowed to apply for asylum. So you may recall that there were a lot of family units entering in the summer under, through Del Rio, through Texas, a lot of Haitian families. And so they were allowed to come in and then permitted to apply for asylum, and they were not detained. So, because there's just really nowhere, you can't detain. They've tried detaining families for years. I mean, they started doing it under the Bush administration, and there's just too many services that you have to provide for families. It's just not practical to detain people like that en masse.
Do you believe appearance plays a role in the asylum process?
I definitely see the disparate treatment and how they've created these benefits for Ukrainians. So certain countries have been at war for a long time, but they never got TPS. For example, in Cameroon, right? Cameroonians have been coming for a long time now. Their country is at war, and they only recently got TPS, and that was after Ukraine.
How do you see things playing out for the non-Ukrainian refugees?
Ultimately, I think, it's going to come down to, does the administration have the capability to process these asylum seekers? Because once you open the border for asylum, it's going to happen. I mean, year after year, you see the people coming, and now with more environmental disasters and the economy just doing so poorly in certain countries, people are coming for many different reasons, including economic reasons. And I think that the Biden administration really needs to have a process in place so that they can process these people. You don't have to hold them, at the border in detention circumstances. I don't necessarily think that the Ukrainian situation will help the Central American cause. My thing is that I'm more about a fair process. Like, give people a fair process to seek asylum, and, really fair. Like, you don't have Border Patrol officers that are, like, yelling at people and, intimidating them and not to tell their stories, or even inaccurately recording their stories. And so as long as the process is fair and transparent, then at least people know what qualifies and what doesn't.
What do you find most difficult when helping someone seek asylum?
Some of the hardest parts for me, I think, are, educating the adjudicator, so the asylum officer, the judge, the government attorney, about the country conditions, about what life is like in that particular country. And this often comes up in the context of when the judge is trying to decide if the asylum seeker is what we call credible. Because in every good system there are people that are going to be abusing the system, and people will lie. That is not in my experience, it's not the majority of asylum seekers at all. It's a very, very small percentage. But it does happen, and so that because of that, there's very strict rules in place where the judge has to determine if the person is credible. And so, you can imagine you have a judge who has their experiences in life trying to assess this asylum seeker's credibility and their cultural differences that come into play. I have in the past represented a lot of Eritreans, and if you're not familiar with Eritrea, it's near it's in East Africa, kind of close to Ethiopia. And that country, they call it the North Korea of Africa. It's very, very oppressive. They have like a national service system where you have mandatory military service and you go into national service, and it's like slavery. And a lot of people speak out against the government and then end up being sent to horrific prisons and really, really terrible conditions. Like, I'm talking like shipping containers, and being held in shipping containers and desert heat, and then desert cold. And those people, because they grew up in such an oppressive system, they have Eritreans, their emotional affect is, I would say, not at all like a Western affect. They don't have the same expressions. They often speak matter-of-factly when they talk about what has happened to them. Horrific stories that would make most people cry and break down. But because of the way that they've grown up and the way that the things that they've witnessed and suffered, they've learned to suppress their emotions. They have to survive. And so when they're in court and they're telling these horrific stories and they're just so matter-of-fact about it, the judge is like, well, I'm not sure I believe you because your emotional affect is lacking. I think that most people would break down and cry when they're telling this story. So, you have to really educate the judge about, the country and then the psychological effects and on your particular client. And that part is like hard because there's only so much you can glean from a report, you know. So you have to really kind of tell your clients, you know, this is what the judge is expecting you to do. You know, I'm not saying that you have to do that, but, you know, don't suppress your emotions, which is, you know, it's hard. And testifying in itself is not an easy thing to do. I mean, you're talking about really personal, horrific details about your life to complete strangers. You know, like they know me, but they don't know the government attorney and they don't know the judge. And making sure that your client is credible and the judges can find like simple inconsistencies in their stories, or there can be a translator error. Like I had a client that was denied asylum because there was a translator error in regards to like where he was being transferred. And we actually had to go back and get that transcribed and explain to the court that there was an error to get that fixed. I would just say that asylum in the United States is very complex. It's more complex than people probably realize. Immigration is just one of those areas of law where it just swings back and forth, you know, depending if it's Republican or Democratic government. And the executive has a lot of power over the system. I want to say that maybe another aspect of that's difficult for asylum seekers is just the length of time that passes from when you file your claim to when you get a final answer. I have a case that's been delayed for a long time for various different reasons. It started out as an affirmative asylum claim, so the person came in on visas, applied for asylum. They were not my client at that point. But then their case got referred to court because they couldn't establish to the asylum office through USCIS that they qualified. And so now we're in court. And because of translator issues and just not enough judges, and then the pandemic, a case that started in like 2016 is now going to trial finally. So that's another hard aspect, is just the time that it takes.
How would you describe the difference in treatment for a group such as the Haitians?
I mean, if you think about it, like, you know, Haitians, they've had a lot of problems, you know. I mean, their president was recently assassinated. I mean, the only I can think of is like their country is not at real war. Like there's no foreign invader. I think that's the only thing that you can make a distinction on the Ukrainian situation. But all in all, these are all refugees, you know. And if you're a refugee, you know, why does it really matter why you're fleeing? You're a refugee. I mean, it doesn't matter. So either we accept refugees or we don't. I mean, what is the policy? If everyone's fleeing for a specific reason, why do some people get in and some people don't? That would be, I think, a good question to ask the administration is, if you're a refugee, you're a refugee. Does it really matter why you're fleeing? You know, why are Ukrainians have this special program where they're allowed in and others don't? And I wonder if the public would, you know, where this respond as well. Like if Haitians coming in and needing sponsors, would there be charitable organizations and people that organize to help them find sponsors? I really hope the administration eventually comes to some sort of balance where they feel like there's enough border security, because that's always what they point to in the name of, you know, reducing asylum seekers or reducing migrants that are coming into is just border security. I mean, obviously, as an immigration attorney, I have a bias about like wanting to help as many people as possible, but the world is changing and there's just so many people that need help, and we have unfortunately we have the resources. So I guess we as a country and as a nation have to ask ourselves, do we want to share those resources with people and help other people? I know the common theme is that, well, we need to help ourselves and we need to help our own first. But then, you know, when they talk about plans to help our own first, I always feel like they're like, well, they need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. So it's like, well, are we going to use those resources to help ourselves or not? You know, so I feel like, there's always some sort of like excuse. But I really feel like we do, as a country, have the space. I remember Trump once said there's no more space or something. But we do have the space and resources to help people who are fleeing their country for various different reasons. So, I mean, we obviously need the workers. So, you know, so, yeah. But that's, you know, It's really hard with asylum. It's really hard, I feel like, because I sort of can understand both sides where you want to make sure that you have border protection, you have border security, but at the same time, people should be able to have the right to seek asylum. It's kind of one of the founding, at least when I was growing up and being taught in school, one of the founding principles that you have the right to come and move to the United States and seeks refuge.